Welcome to Contributing to Kubernetes. Why is this so damn hard? I'm Flynn, he's Shane. I am, by day anyway, I'm a tech evangelist for Linkerd at Buoyant. He is a senior principal software engineer for Red Hat. You can note that. For purposes of this talk, though, a lot of what we're doing here is based on our work with the Gateway API. A lot of what we're doing will be informed by what we have done with Gateway API and what we've seen with Gateway API. You can reach us as Flynn and Shane on all the Slacks, or by email if that's your thing. I've started a talk before with this bit. We are not here to tell you that Kubernetes is dead and we should all give up and go back to Mesosphere. But we're also not here to tell you that everything is perfect and we don't need to change anything. We will be talking about some things that we believe are problems. We'll be talking about some potential solutions. We will be talking to you about what we believe and why we believe it. We're not really going to be talking to you about how to actually implement the potential solutions, because that needs to come from everybody here, not just a couple of guys up on stage. You heard some of that from the steering committee earlier. With that in mind, let's start with the fundamental problem, which is not Shane. He's just going to talk about it.
I might be the fundamental problem. So the fundamental problem, Flynn and I thought long and hard about this. Arguably, there are potentially a lot of different problems, but what we think with today's ecosystem in Kubernetes, what it really boils down to right now at this point in time is Kubernetes has had trouble delivering the extensibility that the project needs. And to be fair and clear, this is a perennial computing problem. This is not unique to Kubernetes. This is a tale as old as time. Did I hit the right thing? One sec, I messed something up.
This is what you get for letting the Linux users poke on a Macintosh.
I'll get there, hang on. So at this point, hopefully it stays still. At this point, even official functionality is being pushed to use CRDs rather than going directly into core. Gateway API, network policy, multi-network, etc. These are just examples of projects within Kubernetes SIG network that are building with CRDs now. But there are plenty of examples outside of SIG network. And ultimately, CRDs are not a first-class experience. There are technical challenges with CRDs, including lifecycle management, versioning, upgrading, everything in between. And very problematically, the responsibility of these has, for a long time, largely landed on the cluster operators. And in the worst case, the person who really shouldn't have to deal with this, the user. And as a project, we haven't really caught up with providing the support and guidance needed to do this. Like, we haven't been able to give the cluster operator, or in the very scary case, the user, kind of the tools and the support they need to make this happen well. And yet, despite all of that, and despite how important CRDs are now, especially for the continued growth of Kubernetes, they are the only happy path for contributing for most people, for a lot of people, not all. And it's extremely difficult if you want to go directly into core. Like if you can't build with CRDs or there's something that you want to do in core, that can take a very long time. And it's especially true if you are a new community member. And even if you manage to get through that process, which we'll talk about more in some of the upcoming slides, it takes potentially years for whatever you built to be available in clusters, which is enough time for somebody to no longer even be working on that anymore, be at a different job. It's problematic. So ultimately, we see a lot of situations where the project, particularly through extensibility, isn't really meeting the needs of the community. And the community desperately wants to be able to materially participate in Kubernetes. We're making this quite difficult, and we also understand that this is a natural problem for a project like Kubernetes that has had such a meteoric rise. We just need to try and solve it.
So this raises a question of why we are the ones who are talking about this. The answer is it's personal. both of us have run into this sort of situation, run into difficulties in these areas in a lot of different ways, both as developers who are trying to do things that Kubernetes isn't really supporting, as community members who are trying to fix the things that it's not supporting, leading into being project members or project leads, trying to help everybody fix the things that it's not supporting, and being the educators, trying to teach people how to get things done. As we look back over these things that we've run into, there are a few different areas that we see these things sort of fitting into. So we're going to go over some of those now. To start with, we can talk about problems with CRD APIs. As Shane mentioned, the platform itself only provides very minimal support for managing CRD APIs. This ends up in a situation where, since the platforms aren't doing it, then the end users often have to. If you decide you want to use something that relies on CRDs, then that is a thing that you as a user are likely to have to install, which ends up putting the platforms and the users in this situation that's kind of the wild, wild west of CRDs, where you may know that you want to use a project that relies on one of these APIs, but you may have no good way to be guaranteed that the platform you're using will actually support this. This makes it very difficult for the projects to rely on the extension APIs, which in turn makes it very difficult for the users to rely on the projects. Another thing we run into with this is it causes a lot of interesting friction when you have multiple projects trying to use the same extension API. We have, in particular, seen a situation not too long ago that is a good example of this, where both Linkerd and Traffic, which are two CNCF projects, both were trying to use Gateway API. Since they couldn't rely on the platform to deal with this, both of them tried to ship the Gateway API CRDs that they needed with the project, and they were shipping incompatible versions. This is a problem. Turned out that Linkerd had a way to turn off installing Gateway API CRDs, but Traffic did not for a while. And so for a little while, the only way to deal with this situation was, in fact, to manually hack the Traffic Helm charts. This has been fixed, which is good. The fact that we were ever in the situation, not so good. An even more fun one. Suppose you decide that you don't want to run Traffic and Linkerd anymore, and you're going to switch to Envoy Gateway and Istio. So you uninstall Linkerd and Traffic. Should you uninstall the Gateway API CRDs at the same time? Because if you do uninstall the CRDs, then the API server will happily go and delete every single resource based on those CRDs silently, without warning and without confirmation. Congratulations. Uninstalling your project may have just messed up every single user of your cluster. Great. This is one of the examples where the CRD APIs basically end up fighting with the API server. Not because anybody intended it that way, just because this is the way things have kind of evolved. Similar situation arises when you have platforms. You basically end up where you're making everybody duplicate a lot of effort in this situation. So you can end up with the platforms trying to go and manage these things on their own right now, getting stuck with old versions. Shane and I both got affected by one recently with GKE being stuck on Gateway API 0.old for a while. That's also been fixed now, I believe, but it was an interesting situation to be in. Linkerd is currently in a situation where Gateway API 1.0 relies on cell validation, which relies on Kubernetes 1.25, but Linkerd has long-term support commitments back to Kubernetes 1.22. So going forward with the Gateway API is actually a real challenge in some of these situations. To be fair, Linkerd can use newer Gateway API CRDs if somebody is installing Linkerd on a platform new enough to use them. But how does Linkerd guarantee that they're there? The answer right now is we make the user do it. It's not a great answer. Another interesting situation comes up with experimenting. One of the best ways to design and implement any sort of software, but APIs included, is through experimentation and feedback. Put an experimental version of the thing that you want to use out into the wild, let your users use it, let them tell you what they think of it, and then use that to drive your development iteration. Sometimes when they give you feedback, the feedback will be, you got this completely wrong, please change it entirely. They will want you to do a breaking change. Kubernetes doesn't really have good support for breaking changes. The sanctioned method for breaking changes involves using a CRD conversion webhook, which we all know and love. Everybody, including SIG API machinery, tells you, oh no, don't use conversion webhooks. So we're in a state where the only way to really do breaking changes is to do a thing that nobody recommends, which leads us into this world where the recommended design paradigm is to be a perfect API designer. I personally find this really difficult. Maybe some of you have an easier time of it, but there's a lot of work around this that people are trying to come up with ways of dealing with it. In fact, right after this session, Rob and Nick, I think over in one of the breakout rooms, are going to be talking about CRDs and their challenges specifically. I do not think we're going to have time for questions after this talk, so I would encourage all of y'all to follow us over there. It's still, the current state of the world is just get it right the first time and don't ever change anything, which is, challenging. It's also worth noting there is a phase in our current enhancement processes that is usually labeled experimental. It's really more like staging. There's a de facto assumption that once you hit experimental, you will be proceeding forward. Shane and I looked back. We don't believe Gateway API has ever rejected anything once it's become experimental, which means that experimental isn't really experimental. True. We might be succeeding in being perfect API designers.
Yeah, we got it.
I'm a guess not. We also have, speaking of the enhancement processes themselves, they have a reputation for being slow and painful, and I would like to very clearly point out, I am not just talking about the KEP process here. GEPs, the Gateway Enhancement proposal that we use in Gateway API, are also becoming slow and painful. Yeah, it's a little bit tricky. There's a lot of tricky documentation. There's a lot of obscure rules. The end result is that actually walking through these can be really intimidating. Again, doubly so if you're new to it, which is challenging to say the least. Again, let me emphasize, this is not just for core stuff. This applies to CRD APIs as well. But I will say, speaking of the core, I went back and did some data munging on KEPs. At present, there seem to be more abandoned KEPs than stable KEPs or rejected KEPs. Abandonment in this case means I couldn't see any progress on it in at least a year. Actually, getting a KEP through to stable, the average looks like it's about a year and a half, maybe longer, which isn't necessarily unreasonable, except for all the outliers that take way, way, way longer than that. And the abandoned KEPs, interestingly, seem to not be spending much less time there, meaning that even the process of taking a KEP into a place where you abandon it seems to be a significant amount of effort just to abandon it and never have anybody officially say, we're not working on this anymore. We would be remiss, of course, not to mention dynamic resource allocation here. It's a fascinating outlier. That QR code will take you to the DRA page itself. It's interesting because it's an extension mechanism that's trying to go and affect things in core, but also ends up kind of messing with CRDs as well in some cases. And one might expect that because it's having to touch both of these areas, that DRA would get the worst of both worlds. It kind of seems like it's not. I'm not going to lie, I have heard a certain amount of cynicism about some of the process around DRA. I tend to look at it personally as a nice example of the fact that it actually is possible to get stuff done. And it would be lovely to go through and learn from some of this stuff.
Talk to me if you have questions.
We will do that, as we have. And I think we're over to Shane to talk about how we've seen this in the subprojects.
Yeah, so we've talked about a lot of the problems that we've seen, and we have been talking about this mostly from the frame of reference of Gateway API. So everything you've seen so far has some kind of connection with our work on Gateway API. However, we participate in and have been actively involved in other sub-projects that have had these kinds of troubles. For instance, we have the multi-network project in SIG network, which is the idea that you can have a pod that can have more than one network. This has really struggled to get through the KEP process, to the extent that it was in the KEP process in what looks almost like an abandoned state for about 2 years. At this point, the project has decided to go ahead and try the other route. Let's go with CRDs. And they're having some difficulties with this as well. There is progress, and it's still moving forward. The meetings are happening, but this is challenging, especially since, did I hit the wrong button again?
No, we both hit it twice. It's okay.
Don't hit the, anyway. So it's, okay. So it's the little engine that could. Like, it's going, but it has been very painful for this sub-project, just trying to get any forward momentum. As of late last year and through this year, there was a project called the Kubernetes Network Interface, or KNI. You may have also heard it as Kubernetes Networking Reimagined. This project, originally, what it was trying to do was add native networking APIs to Kubernetes. And I say native as in, think CNI, but you can actually kubectl get things. You can actually see it. It's there in the API server. And it has gone through some similar pains with, being able to get through the KEP process. It was unable to, and it's ultimately not abandoned, but more or less on pause. And while we're kind of looking at DRA, and DRA is kind of taking the forefront of, like, DRA for networking is kind of taking the idea forward as to how we would do these sort of things in a different way, and we're hoping to come back to it. And then this isn't exactly a sub-project, but it's very related. There's the Kubernetes Network Plumbing Working Group, NPWG, which, if you don't know, and despite the name, is not actually an official working group within Kubernetes, even though it's been around for 7 years. And it stayed outside because of these challenges, partially, in Kubernetes with contributing and being able to do experimentation like Flynn was talking about. It was easier to just go outside. However, just at this KubeCon in particular, we are starting some conversations about maybe we can actually bring that in and turn that into something of maybe like the place where experimentations can happen for certain kinds of work. And also, we're very grateful that a lot of the KNI energy that may have been lost because it kind of hit a brick wall there for a while has started to kind of find its way into this space, and also CNI. So it's good that we didn't lose all of that energy. And then, and this one, I say this one with a heavy heart. So there's the kubeproxy next generation, or KPNG project, which was very near and dear to me personally. This project meant a lot to me. I made a lot of friends through this project. It inspired me in many ways, and unfortunately, despite its efforts to be, the question of kubeproxy next generation, if you haven't heard about it, was, what would the next generation of kubeproxy look like? Like, what could we do? And there was a lot of energy around experimenting, trying new things. There was a large community building up within our community, but ultimately, because of the problems with contributing and kind of the friction therein, this community kind of fizzled out. It didn't all fizzle out. I mean, I brought some of my energy from there elsewhere in SIG Network, and we've seen a couple people, but it wasn't a great resolution, and ultimately it ended up being one of these abandoned projects. It's actually, to try to make, it's the first officially closed sub-project in SIG Network, just to let people know. We didn't want to leave it in that abandoned state forever, and we're starting to try, hopefully, to actually say when something's been concluded, and it was, very unfortunately for me, the first one, so.
All right, so let's talk about some solutions, and we get to ramp up this section in terms of speed. We're going to look at some of these with respect to the areas that we're talking about, CRDs, enhancements, things like that. We can start with CRDs, and we can kind of start with the obvious of, there's a certain amount of stuff in the CRD process where we can go through and actually do the radical thing of trying to teach people what works well, and arguably more importantly, what doesn't work well, so that if you're a new project coming into this trying to use the extension APIs, trying to use the CRD process, you don't actually have to start from scratch. This is underway. There's some work in SIG Network with the API Extensions Best Practices Guide. That's the QR code for that. It's deliberately broader than SIG Network, and it's actually challenging, more difficult than it seems, more harder, oh my God, because it requires us as a community to agree on what is best, or at least what is good. Another thing that we can do for CRDs is improving CRD validation. This is not about the validation that happens when you apply a CRD. This is about the fact that it's not difficult to make a change for a new CRD version that will end up breaking your stored objects. That is a thing that we can check automatically. We can also do other things. We can automate the checks so that when you make a change to a new version of the definition itself, there are some places where we can catch mistakes ahead of time and hopefully not wound your users. There's also work ongoing with this, OpenShift's CRD schema checker. That's the link to its GitHub repo. That's a thing that SIG API Machinery is looking at as an add-on for the API server, which could be kind of interesting. Another thing that I think we ought to do is, there are languages other than Go in the ecosystem. I realize that's a shock to everyone. Right now, when we define CRDs, we define them typically as Go structures, which means that you see idioms there like, oh, there's a pointer. That must mean it's something where we have to be able to tell the difference between unset and default. And it would be really nice if those of us working in languages other than Go, Rust, could maybe not have to reverse engineer those idioms from Go to be able to effectively use CRDs. And we are back to Shane.
Yeah. So we won't go into the deep details like we said, but the how is not the most important thing here. But some of the things we thought of solutions-wise is that we need to give the platforms an effective way to manage extensions. Right now, it's up to the cluster operator, as we said, or worst case, the user to say, well, I'm going to go extend the API because I need it for this project, and that's not a good situation to be in. They have to upgrade and manage, in the worst case, and Flynn mentioned this earlier, delete the CRDs? Are they responsible for that?
Hopefully not.
Hopefully not. Ultimately, we think we need to give the platform standard and consistent way to manage these extension APIs for their users. This would let users be able to rely on the extension APIs in the same way they do the core APIs. In the case of the actual user, as opposed to like the cluster operator, they don't have to think about a CRD. Important caveat, we do need to make sure, and we've seen this from the perspective of Gateway API, we need to be very sure that we protect the ability for developers to do experimentation. So whatever we end up doing, let's just make sure that we kind of create a bubble for that. So to summarize a little bit, or what we've decided we think would be a good idea, given that we have official extension APIs. Gateway API is an official API, all things considered. Let's actually treat them as official. Let's host them, catalog them, validate them, and test them. Maybe we could have Kubernetes/extensions and have a place where we catalog our official extensions so that platform builders can build with this tool and users will get a consistent experience between platform to platform. Projects know how these things are built. And overall, it's not just that wild, wild west of, well, we'll kind of just, each of us do our own thing. We'll install CRDs in a Helm chart, but somebody else will do something different. And that's CRDs. So CRDs are like what we're trying to ship because that's the best way to contribute to Kubernetes today. But enhancement process still needs some streamlining. Like we still need to go through the enhancement process even for CRDs to ultimately come up with whatever we're shipping. And unfortunately and fortunately, like enhancement process it is documentation. So making that better starts with documentation. But, and we've got some, the API Extensions Best Practices Guide we're working on in SIG Network kind of touches on this with like how to make that process as streamlined as possible for somebody, particularly who's new. But ultimately, we need to teach people directly as a community how to get started effectively in a way that sets them up for success. And this probably needs to not just be a wall of documentation, but rather like verbal, something that we communicate in community meetings or Slack or something like that.
And since we are pretty much out of time,
Oh, are we out of time?
I think we're going to close with this slide.
Yeah, so we, in Gateway API, we've had this concept that we've shared around before verbally about champions, allies, and shepherds. And it amounts to basically putting people before process. So
Which
the
you
idea,
also heard at the steering committee AMA, right?
yeah. And the general idea with this is it's kind of a framework for don't inundate new people with like, here, go read the docs and stuff like that, but rather tell them, here's a framework in which you can kind of try to see if you can build an enhancement. It doesn't have to be just for enhancements, but for the purposes of enhancements, you have champions, which is a role where somebody is driving this thing forward. And it can be more than one. It doesn't have to be like one champion for any project. Allies are stakeholders that support it. They're maybe not driving as hard as the champions out in front, but ultimately they are meaningful contributors to whatever it is. And shepherds, which are the maintainers. They're the ones who need to be kind of helping you get there and eventually having you actually figure out all that documentation, but that not be a barrier to entry to you even getting started. And if you can do this and you can find allies, you'll find a way forward. If you find, importantly as a note here, that you do this process, or if you reach out and you don't see anybody, actually this might not be the right time for that enhancement, which is good feedback as well.
And yeah, we do need to stop, but
Okay.
everything we've talked about so far is the easy part. The hard part is going through and changing the focus on extensibility so that it is a priority within the community. That is going to take all of us, everybody here, everybody in the community, as you also heard at the steering committee AMA. So yeah, come help out. Thank you.